Sam Yale from Level Access, which is an accessibility company, and he is also on the FCC's Disability Advisory Committee. He has a great presentation prepared for you. There you go, Sam.
Okay. Thank you, Lily. And thank you to 3Play Media for having me and having Level Access. My name is Sam Yale. I'm a principal accessibility consultant with Level Access. My colleague Owen Edwards will be giving this presentation tomorrow in LA at the 3Play Media event. So if you want to hear it again, feel free to go to LA and see him present. I have no idea what he's going to say. So it might be a completely different presentation. Okay, so in terms of who are we, you may never have heard of Level Access before. Level Access has been around for 20 years, but we used to go by the name SSB BART Group. And we went through a marketing rebranding, and we are now called Level Access because it's a lot easier to say, it's a lot easier to spell, and it's a more compelling story in terms of our name. So in terms of what we do, we sit on several advisory boards, including the W3C. We've submitted comment to the Access Board about Section 508. As Lily mentioned, I sit on the FCC Disability Advisory Committee, and we just had a meeting yesterday. I flew in from DC this morning, and yesterday we had a great meeting talking about access to emergency information, as you know, is very critical at this time in this country. And then also we talked about access to real-time text, which I'll be talking about a little bit during this presentation. So we sit on advisory boards. We also do audits. We test websites. We test hardware, software, mobile apps. We can dig into the code and tell developers how to fix their code to make products more accessible. And roughly about half of our workforce consists of users with disabilities. So the recommendations that we make are recommendations that we know work in the real world because we know that they reflect the preferences of the disability community and that they're solutions that have been tested by users with disabilities as well. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to talk about today, this is our Digital Trends 2017 presentation, which we usually give this talk at CSUN, the CSUN conference. And we've also given it at Access U this year. So this is essentially divided into three areas. The first area is the big picture. We're going to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in the market and the industry. And then we're going to dig into the laws and regulations, how laws, regulations, and standards are setting and affecting trends. And then we're also going to talk about some technologies to watch. So that's the general overview for what we're going to try to squeeze into the next half hour. All right, so the big picture. One of the trends that many people are already aware of is the aging population, right? People are getting older every day. People are living longer. And so as a result, you have more people living longer who may develop a disability later in life. And so we're seeing an increased and accelerated trend for that. Certainly with the baby boomer generation, and then as Gen X ages, and as the various generations tend to get older, we're going to have more people in the age range over 50 where the disability incidence is going to increase, and more people are going to be in need of various solutions that are often used by individuals with disabilities.
Excuse me, please. The audio is connected along to audio. The audio isn't coming through.
The audio is not coming through?
I'll get it.
The captioner needs audio, and the audio has been lost. I don't know.
Okay.
The audio.
Am I not speaking close enough to the mic?
You're coming through the mic, so.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to continue and hopefully we can get this resolved.
The captioner can't hear the sound.
Okay, So again, we expect population 65 years and older to be 16% by the year 2050. One thing to note about the aging population is that they are often not likely to identify as having a disability, and they may be resistant to using things that are labeled as assistive technologies. So if you tell your grandmother she needs to use a screen reader, she might balk at that and say, I don't have a disability, I don't need a screen reader, right? But we see how solutions that benefit individuals with disabilities that make their way into the mainstream, how they tend to be more embraced by the disability community. An example of that would be like your personal assistants, like the Amazon Echo, Google Home, Siri, et cetera, right? Those obviously have benefits for different types of disabilities, and they tend to be embraced by the mainstream as well. So things such as the ability to resize text, or the ability to increase amplification of audio for hearing loss. These features, which are packaged as mainstream features, they're more likely to be embraced by the aging population that doesn't identify as having a disability. All right, so millennials are being phased out, and they're being replaced by Generation Z. So Generation Z essentially is individuals born between 1998 and 2016, so it's the current crop of kids, I guess you could say. And we know that they are even more connected, and they're connected with even more devices. So they're always on, they're usually connected to the internet very quickly. They're embracing today's technological age, and therefore they tend to use more technology, they tend to use more devices, an average of 5 screens per individual versus 2 screens for Generation X or millennials. And they expect their content and their functionality to be accessible from all these different devices using all these different modalities. So whether they're on their phone, whether they're on a tablet, whether they're using voice input, whether they're using gestures, whatever modality they're using, they expect to be able to gain access to their information. And that's the way the culture is moving, where information is available on multiple devices via multiple modalities, and people expect to be able to get access to it no matter how they're accessing it. Okay, in terms of mobile use, certainly mobile use is obviously increasing, right? So more individuals are using mobile devices for tasks that were traditionally done on a desktop, including surfing the internet, making purchases, and certainly in underdeveloped countries where there's a higher use of mobile devices and lower use of desktops, we see smartphone usage being a primary driver for accessing the internet and internet content. Generally, we would consider laptops to be desktops, but of course, you have your hybrid devices like your tablets with your keyboards, your screens and keyboards that rotate, so they could be in somewhat like a hybrid category. Okay, so certainly mobile usage is increasing among people with disabilities as well. The advantage with mobile platforms is that the assistive technology is built directly into the platform. So clearly that is an advantage for individuals with disabilities. We still see that desktop currently is the primary mode of access, but mobile is clearly catching up, and it's starting to reach parity. Primarily, in terms of statistics, most of those we get from the WebAIM screen reader survey. Those are the published statistics that we have access to. One thing that we've noticed is a flip between mobile penetration platforms between the disabled and the non-disabled community. So you can see that with mainstream usage, that Android far exceeds iOS, but in the disability space, especially among screen reader users, that it's flipped, and iOS far exceeds Android. And that primarily has to do with accessibility support on those mobile platforms. The iOS platform is more mature. It has more accessibility support and features than Android does, but Android is starting to catch up. Okay, so advanced communication and social media, these are areas that are starting to catch up, right? They cross all areas of life, whether you're talking about gaming, whether you're talking about, you know, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat posts, right? They are, clearly this is where content is heading in terms of consumer-generated content, and they do cross all boundaries from personal to work to entertainment to education. You know, pretty much everybody has a Facebook or a Twitter account or Instagram, right? Mobile is the dominant platform for communication, which also drives mobile access as well. Accessible communication services required under FCC in the US, and there are similar requirements globally. So advanced communication services are essentially non-telephone based communications, so that would be text-based, video, or voice-based chat over IP. And as far as the FCC is concerned, text-based chat can include email and messaging as well. Mike had mentioned the CVAA in the last session, and so the CVAA is the law that is driving a lot of these rules being passed by the FCC, requiring these forms of communication to be accessible. We're also noticing improvements on the social media front among the social media platforms. We're noticing improvements in keyboard access, the creation of automatic alternative text descriptions, etc., on these social media platforms. And one thing to note about the Generation Z generation is that they do tend to prefer to communicate via photos, images, and via video. So it becomes even more crucial that individuals who can't see the images and the videos have some way to gain access to the content that all of these people are posting using images and video. Clearly, it's nearly impossible, unless you're Oath, right, to caption everything. So there needs to be technology built in using artificial intelligence to describe some of these images. Okay, multi-channel, multi-device commerce. So we are seeing that things are being purchased on many different types of devices, right? So e-commerce is huge. It was 8.7% in 2016. We're expecting it to grow. Certainly when you see things like Amazon buying up Whole Foods and e-commerce replacing, you know, brick and mortar commerce. Clearly, the trend is going towards e-commerce, and it is growing steadily. Not only that, but people are purchasing on many different devices, right? They're purchasing on their mobile phones, they're purchasing on their desktops, they're also purchasing using their voice-powered assistants, such as the Amazon Echo and the Google Home. So it's important for all of these different channels to be accessible, and that there are alternative channels available when one channel is not accessible. All right, how are we doing for time here? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about laws, regulations, and standards. So digital accessibility is clearly a global issue, and that was spurred very much by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. So there are 172 different states, as they call them in the UN, or countries, that have ratified the CRPD, and there are 15 countries that have signed it. And in terms of the CRPD, there is a clause in the CRPD that requires access to information and communications. So ICT, or information communications technology, is covered under the CRPD, And countries that have ratified the CRPD must pass laws or legislation to actually uphold the values in the CRPD. So that's one reason that we're seeing an increase in countries passing accessibility laws. And so now we're going to talk about some of the various laws in the various countries. So in the US, here we have Section 508, which has been around for a very long time. It's been around, the original standards were passed back in 1998, and the Access Board, which is the standards making body for 508, just updated those standards. And those were published on January 18th of this year. So the compliance date for the new 508 standards is 1 year from the date they were published. So that's January 18th of next year that the federal agencies have to start complying with the new 508 standards. 508 is a law that requires that federal agencies that purchase, develop, use, or maintain information communications technology, that technology has to be accessible to federal employees with disabilities and also to the public. And so that requires the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which is the law that governs all government purchases. That has to be updated with the new 508 standards. Those were supposed to be updated within 6 months of publication. At this point, we've seen that there may be an NPRM, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, issued this month for that. And we have yet to see that come out yet. Okay, some more on the refresh. So the refresh has what's called a safe harbor, which means that any technology that was developed before the compliance date, as long as it complies with the old standards, doesn't have to comply with the new standards. So if it's not altered and it's developed before the new compliance date, and it complies with the old standards, it doesn't have to be updated to comply with the new standards. So currently, the agencies have to comply with the original standards that are currently in effect. The Access Board updated the standards for Section 508 and also for Section 255, which is the Telecommunications Act Accessibility Guidelines, which is essentially the guidelines that the FCC uses to publish their rules. And then the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is a template that vendors will often use to report the compliance of their products against Section 508. That was just updated by the Information Technology Industry Council, which is a collection of industry organizations. And they update that on October 4th. And we do have a webinar about the VPAT 2.0. If you're involved with VPATs, you can go back and watch that webinar on our website, levelaccess.com. So some high-level themes in terms of the 508 refresh. They're using consensus-based standards when possible. That means that the standards are now updated to reflect international consensus standards. Namely, the big one is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, which you may have heard of. That tends to be the industry standard for accessibility of web content and other software around the world. They also harmonize with other international standards and regulations. They focus on functional use over product type. So what that means is that rather than the standards being organized around what type of product is it a website, is it a piece of software, is it a portable computer, the standards are now organized around what are the functions of the product. So if you have something like a smartphone, obviously that's going to cross many different product types, right? It's a telephone, it's also a computer, it also contains hardware, software, some web content and video, multimedia, right? So that's going to have multiple standards that apply to it. And so the new 508 is focused around functionality rather than product type, whereas the old standards were focused or organized around product type. There are some new functional standards added for cognitive disabilities and also for color deficiencies or color blindness. And there's some more specific coverage defined for electronic content. And the applicability of documentation and electronic documents was not clearly defined in the original standards, and so that has been updated and improved. There are some new requirements for software to make sure that the software is interoperable with assistive technology, that it works in conjunction with assistive technology. And there are requirements for authoring tools. In other words, tools that are used to create other software or other content, that they actually have to produce accessible content and that they have to be accessible themselves. So generally, the standards bring the requirements up to the modern era to apply to more modern technology than what was passed back in 1998. And then also the hardware standards were updated to permit front-facing access to hardware. And we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. This is more on 508. Again, 508 is harmonized with international standards, and the idea behind that is that the more harmonization you have, the easier it becomes to sell across to multiple markets, and that's going to hopefully encourage technology vendors to make their products accessible as they sell across the world. The idea is one global accessibility standard is going to make it easier to develop products that comply with as many standards as possible. So 508 was harmonized with standards in other countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, or the EU. We're going to talk about the EU in a minute. The EU directives standard EN 301-549, which is a public procurement standard. Okay, so quickly some updates to what was added for hardware. They now have referred to closed functionality instead of closed products, because you could have a product that would normally be open, but it might be locked down within an agency, right? They might lock down the desktop configuration and therefore make it closed so that you can't install any assistive technology. There are now new requirements for speech output for products that contain a display screen. There are now requirements for Braille instructions to turn on the speech or to activate it. There are new requirements for font height and contrast for characters that are shown on displays and on variable message signs. There are some new privacy requirements that were not in the original standard. And there are some new requirements for ticket and fare card machines, for use of tickets and fare cards. And there are new requirements for height, forward, and side reach for parts that are used for hardware. There are also some requirements for wideband speech, which is high definition audio on IP-based networks, which sounds better than the telephone network. It's easier to understand for individuals with hearing loss. And then finally, there are some new captioning and audio description requirements that have been updated for digital media and digital tuners that are contained in both the hardware and the software standards. So they did change that. They did increase that to, they broke it down with by hardware and software, whereas the old 508 just had it in a separate section. Okay, in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the ADA does not specifically refer to the web or technology in the law itself. So right now, the ADA is being enforced primarily through litigation. So the advocacy groups and various groups continue to file lawsuits and other litigation under the ADA. And of course, the rulings have gone different ways, depending on which court hears the ruling. Some have ruled in favor that the web applies to the ADA, and some have not. But we do expect that legal risk management is going to drive accessibility for the ADA. In other words, the banks and the educational institutions, et cetera, we expect that they are going to want to be accessible in order to mitigate risk of any type of legal action, rather than to comply with some sort of laws that have not been clearly delineated. Functional use by people with disabilities still remains the key issue under the ADA. That usually are what complaints tend to be around but they tend to settle around conformance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as the defined standard for achieving access under the ADA. And we do have a blog post called ADA and the Internet. It's a blog series that you can check out if you want more information about applicability of the ADA. We are noticing some acceleration in litigation. In 2016, there were 244 lawsuits by October of 2016. Clearly, that's a steep increase. Some of these have been, what are referred to as drive-by lawsuits, where individuals are filing, or law firms are filing complaints, and they may not be on behalf of an individual who has actually attempted to use the website. So that's one reason for the spike. But we are seeing a rampant increase in ADA-related litigation. Okay, FCC laws. So the FCC rules cover a wide range of areas, including television, video broadcasting, hearing aid compatibility for phones, text relay for the deaf. This is all telecommunications. Real-time text, which is the next version of TTY. Closed captioning and video, captioning and video description, as Mike had talked about before. And then also access to video apparatus, being able to access media players. Access to advanced communication services, as I had mentioned, mobile browsers, and then relay equipment for the deafblind. So this obviously has an impact on a lot of different verticals, and we work with a lot of different clients to help them to comply with with the FCC rules under the CVAA and other FCC rules. Advanced communication services, I talked about that before, text, voice, and video, two-way communication. Those are now covered under the CVAA. So is playback of video programming and being able to access the various devices, such as the TVs, the Rokus, the game consoles, any type of entertainment that contains a video player. And so a lot of these rules have been spurred by the CVAA, which directed the FCC to pass rules around these areas. Okay, so I did mention real-time text. So real-time text is eventually going to replace TTY. So TTY is a way for individuals with hearing or speech disabilities to communicate over the telephone network. It essentially converts text into audio tones and then sends it over the phone network so that it can be transmitted by audio. But as the phone network has become digital and moved from copper-based switch networks over to IP-based networks, there's been a lot of audio loss, which has made TTY communication more difficult. And so as a result, real-time text is going to replace TTY, and real-time text essentially sends data over an IP-based network so that you're getting the text rather than having it converted to audio and then having it converted back to text. So the difference between real-time text and something like text messaging or instant messaging is that the character shows up on the receiving party's end as soon as it's typed. There isn't a delay in receiving the characters while you're waiting for them to hit send or hit enter and then having a whole block of text transmitted. So as you can imagine, it's very crucial for emergency situations and other situations where you need to receive information immediately. Currently in the 508 refresh, real-time text has been reserved. They're waiting for the FCC to pass their final rules on real-time text. And the FCC has passed some preliminary rules, but the Access Board, right now there's a gap in the refresh where real-time text is not covered and neither is TTY. But TTY is still covered under the telecommunications rules passed by the FCC. Okay, the Air Carrier Access Act, that's a law that's been around for quite a long time, since 1986. And recently the Department of Transportation, they issued rules a couple of years ago requiring that the airlines make their websites and their kiosks accessible to people with disabilities. So there's a timetable by December of last year all U.S. and foreign carriers level AA by December 2016 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then also that date began the rollout of kiosks, where up to 25% of airport kiosks by the airlines need to have a screen reader built in and talk for individuals who can't read the screen. Okay. The European Union, they have a procurement law. They have an EU directive, which was recently passed. And it was formally approved in July 2016 by the European Council. And the general idea behind the directive is to harmonize requirements across the various EU states and get them to require that public sector websites and mobile applications meet European accessibility standards. And so that was originally based on the European standard EN 301549, which is a technical standard for meeting accessibility in Europe. That standard is currently being updated because they have to update it to address mobile apps. And so they're trying to update it to coincide with WCAG 2.1, which is going to address mobile apps and gestures and things that were not addressed in WCAG 2.0. But the way the timeline flushes out, the European Union, they have to update their standards before WCAG 2.1 is going to be passed. And so there could be some disharmony between the two due to the fact that the European standard will get passed first, and they wanted to base it on WCAG 2.1. Okay, so now we're going to talk briefly about some technologies to watch out for. As we mentioned, mobile is growing, and so we expect mobile penetration to grow among users with disabilities. We expect more individuals with disabilities to be using assistive technologies built into mobile devices. In terms of desktop versus mobile, historically desktop has been more complicated to implement accessibility. There's lots of legacy code, and it's accessibility is often achieved by third-party products and compliance with various application programming interfaces or through scripting, whereas mobile has a much lower learning curve. It's a little easier for developers to implement, and the accessibility features are built directly into the platform. So it's not as difficult to achieve accessibility on mobile platforms. There isn't scripting the way there is on desktop, where you can basically control the assistive technology and control its behavior within certain applications. Okay, multi-device access. So this is an area, especially with the Internet of Things, with these voice-powered assistants, with various devices, we're seeing multiple solutions or modalities being used to access devices. And this is obviously very beneficial for individuals with disabilities. If you have internet-aware devices, such as your thermostat, you could control the thermostat at home with your voice, and then you could control it while you're away from home using an app. Obviously, having these multiple modalities makes the devices more usable by individuals with disabilities. If they're unable to use the primary interface, they might be able to use an app with their phone paired to the device. And so this makes it possible to use the right device for the right task, or the right device for the particular needs of the user. So by 2020, there should be 34 billion devices that are internet aware or internet always on IoT devices. So clearly, more and more devices can be controlled by the internet. That has benefits for individuals with disabilities. When you give them an interface that they can use to control that device, whether it's a mobile app on their phone, whether it's through a voice assistant, whatever it is, you provide multiple paths for the user to then be able to access the functionality of that device, and it obviously it increases the number of users who can use that device. Voice assistants are becoming huge. Google Home, Amazon Echo, Apple's speaker that's coming out. They're growing among home usage and elsewhere. Artificial intelligence, that's the general theme of these technology trends. We're seeing application of artificial intelligence to solve a lot of problems and create a lot of cool technologies. And so a lot of these technologies that we're going to be talking about use some form of AI or are powered by AI. And certainly the voice assistants fall into that category as well. Briefly, we're going to touch on responsive web design. So responsive web design is all about being able to access the same content or the same site using many different devices, whether you're on a mobile phone or a tablet. The good news is that often accessibility will carry over across multiple devices, so you often don't have to do anything special for a responsive site. The most important thing to do is to test a lot, right? And test on these different devices to determine where there are accessibility gaps. And frameworks have become a common coding approach for responsive sites. And a lot of the accessibility of these frameworks are starting to improve, but sometimes it is necessary to actually remediate or fix the frameworks to address gaps, accessibility gaps in the frameworks. Okay, automated image descriptions. This is another area where artificial intelligence is being used. I mentioned this with respect to Generation Z, preferring to communicate via images and video. With them posting all of these images and videos, then how do we make that content available to someone who can't see or process the image? Companies like Microsoft with their cognitive services, Facebook with their automatic alternative text, and recently Apple introducing image descriptions into iOS 11 and into Mac OS High Sierra. These companies are embracing using technology to try to describe what's in an image for individuals who can't see the image. And so that's, we're seeing that steadily growing as well. And that obviously is going to make a lot more content accessible, since a lot more content is being posted using images. All right, self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles. We know they're coming. They're big news, right? Currently, no cars permitted on public roads are fully autonomous. There must be a driver present. Now, these vehicles have varying levels of control, right? Like the Tesla Autopilot is semi-autonomous, meaning that it can't actually read street signs, it can't obey traffic and stop signs, and it cannot detect pedestrians and cyclists. So the autonomous features of the Autopilot are supposed to be used on restricted access highways, and a human is supposed to intervene for some of those other features. But then there are vehicles like Waymo, or outfits like Waymo, which used to be Google and Alphabet, which are more autonomous and require less driver intervention. So these vehicles vary in their degree of autonomy, and they tend to, the National Highway and Traffic Administration has developed 6 classifications for the varying degrees of autonomy that these vehicles fall under. As of 2012, at least 41 states and the District of Columbia have considered autonomous vehicle legislation primarily for testing of self-driving vehicles. But the California Department of Motor Vehicles recently, as of like a week or two ago, passed regulations allowing for cars without human drivers to be on the roads beginning sometime in next year, mid of next year. So you have that to look forward to, your driverless cars being on the streets in California next year. And then there is an effort between Local Motors and the CTA Foundation using IBM Watson, or powered by IBM Watson, to create a fully accessible shuttle, and that's called Olli, O-L-L-I. It is a wheelchair accessible driverless shuttle, and it has various accessibility features built in, such as a kneeling bus to allow individuals in wheelchairs to use it. And so they're working on trying to make that vehicle as accessible as possible, and it's been touring around the country visiting various cities. So I know I covered a lot of stuff here. We had a lot to get to in half an hour. I hope that there was some useful information in there. It's clearly an exciting time right now. We're seeing a lot of exciting trends happening, especially around artificial intelligence and increase in accessibility legislation. So this is a great time for accessibility. We're expecting accessibility to improve and increase going forward. So my email address is here on the screen. It's sam.joehl@levelaccess.com. Then Owen's contact information is up here for when he presents tomorrow. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.